All roads converge. On Julian Assange. In previous episodes we already covered the crucifixion of Julian Assange and the banality of evil, as well as the first part of the section on modern-day heretics, looking at heretics on COVID-19. We now move on to heretics on the Holocaust. As did many of the good Jewish girls of my era, I grew up reading the novels of Leon Uris. So I knew of many of the stories of the Holocaust through that lens, particularly the shocking story of the destruction of the residents of the walled Jewish ghetto of Warsaw, Poland, as depicted in the novel Mila 18. Also of the courage of brave partisans, who fought a guerrilla war against the Nazis in Europe, such as in Greece, in the Angry Hills, even as their countries were overrun by the German Third Reich, and its toxic, ideologically poisoned view of a 1,000-year empire in the making. I later, in the 1980s, visited Israel, and the quintessential museum of the Holocaust, Yad Vashem, established in August 1953. Their website states,
"The Holocaust was unprecedented genocide, total and systematic, perpetrated by Nazi Germany and its collaborators, with the aim of annihilating the Jewish people.
For security reasons, I order that the ghetto of Warsaw be demolished. All utilizable building parts and other materials of any value are to first be salvaged. An overall plan for the razing of the ghetto is to be submitted to me. We must in any event ensure that the living space occupied until now by 500,000 subhumans and in no way fit for habitation by Germans disappears completely, and that Warsaw, this city of 1 million, always a centre of corruption and revolt, is reduced in size." Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS.
The primary motivation was the Nazis' anti-Semitic racist ideology. Between 1933 and 1941, Nazi Germany pursued a policy that dispossessed the Jews of their rights and their property, followed by the branding and the concentration of the Jewish population. This policy gained broad support in Germany, and in much of occupied Europe. In 1941, following the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Nazis and their collaborators launched the systematic mass murder of the Jews. By 1945, nearly 6 million Jews had been murdered.
I have also visited, and was deeply moved by, Dachau, one of the Nazi concentration camps, located just outside the German city of Munich. The memorial website for that camp again notes that by 1945, nearly 6 million Jews had been murdered.
On March 22, 1933, a few weeks after Adolf Hitler had been appointed Reich Chancellor, a concentration camp for political prisoners was set up in Dachau. This camp served as a model for all later concentration camps and as a school of violence for the SS men under whose command it stood. In the 12 years of its existence, over 200,000 persons from all over Europe were imprisoned here and in the numerous subsidiary camps. 41,500 were murdered. On April 29, 1945, American troops liberated the survivors.
Before its demolition in 2000, I also visited the World War II memorial site at Singapore's Changi prison, where 7,000 Japanese prisoners of war were transferred from the original 20,000 in the Changi POW camp. Both the prisoner of war camp and prison were further witnesses to the despicable history of man's inhumanity to man, a term coined in 1784 by Robert Burns. King Rat is a novel by survivor James Clavell. It graphically depicts life for the British, Australian, New Zealand and US prisoners in this hellhole. The Changi POW camp, and later prison, were mainly for Allied combatants in the war. While differing from the Nazi concentration camps in scope and in scale, they too remind the world of values, attitudes, and behaviors that we must struggle hard to avoid in our own times. One person present at the opening of Dachau, one of the first concentration camps to be entered by the Allies, was a young Martha Gilhorn, legendary journalist, and, for a brief time, the third wife of Ernest Hemingway. As an aside, on the 2nd of June 2011, Julian Assange was awarded the Martha Gilhorn Prize for Journalism. See Part 7 of this series. Martha Gilhorn was later interviewed, in 1983, by a very young John Pilger, during which he first questioned her about journalistic objectivity, and whether journalists should ever censor themselves. She says no. She then discusses what she experienced at Dachau as she arrived there, on the day the European war ended.
When in wartime, should a journalist censor himself or herself?
I'd think never.
What about in a war of national survival?
You don't have to worry. They've got the censors. I mean, World War II, everything we wrote was censored.
What happened on the day you entered Dachau extermination camp? Now, how could you be objective about what you saw in that extermination camp?
Well, I wasn't objective. I didn't have to be objective. I mean, what I saw was my personal war aim. My personal war aim was to get into Dachau. It was the first concentration camp, an extermination camp, and I did get there, and I was there when, the day the war ended. I didn't have to be objective in the sense that, how could you, what was there to be objective about? It was a total and absolute horror, and all I did was report it as it was. I did not invent anything. If you mean, I don't even know what you mean exactly by objective. If you suppress, I did neither suppress nor invent. I reported it exactly as it was. And if you report what you see, unless your eyes are bad, I don't see how you can be anything but objective. You don't lie, you don't make it different from what it was, you don't conceal something, you don't add something. It's there in front of you. That's what you see, that's what you report.
Could you recall what you saw when you arrived in Dachau that day?
There was a train on a siding. It was a death train. The SS had left, so they hadn't emptied it. So Germans, with handkerchiefs over their face, under the arms of Americans who had gotten there the day before, were opening the doors of it and digging out the bodies of the people who had died in this train. That was the first thing. You went into the gates of the camp and you were sprayed, you opened your clothes, and you were sprayed with powder against typhus lice inside. You went inside and there were figures still alive in striped pajamas, skeletons still breathing, sitting and lying about. By the furnaces there were stacked cordwood bodies, yellow, melting, the little fat still on the skeletons, melting in cordwood because they hadn't had time to burn them. In the prison cells, the torture cells, there was a woman screaming. She was mad, she was alive, she was screaming. There was a bunch of women in cotton dresses, Jews, who had been sent there from someplace else, who clutched one's clothes and screamed like mad women. There was the infirmary, which was manned by Polish doctors, very quiet. They had been there as the sort of laboratory assistants to the German doctors. Dachau was a great experimental center using Jews, Polish priests, gypsies, and they had all the records. And it was a very quiet place, and they just showed me the records. It was the perfect circle of hell.
She then goes on to describe what was on the medical records, many and various medical experiments, involving the torture and/or death of the subject.
They were kept, beautifully kept. I mean, any hospital would have been very pleased with these records. And they did experiments on freezing people to death. So how long it took for a man to die in vats of ice water. In principle, this was to see what would happen to their their flowers if they were shot down in the channel. That, by the way, was one which had a meaning. Mostly they didn't. They injected under the knee furunculosis boils and watched whilst people died in pain of blood poisoning. There were all of the records of castration. They castrated all gypsies, for instance. There were endless records. They never stopped. They tried anything that crossed their minds to do, and they kept beautiful records. And these Polish doctors, who were prisoners, had been forced to attend all of this and do it. I was in the infirmary when the war actually ended. A very tall skeleton wearing a blanket came into the room. He had been dug out of that train that I was speaking of. And he was a very young Pole. And therefore, because he was young, he had survived. He'd been dug out of dead bodies. And he came and he spoke in Polish to these doctors. And what he said to them was, "The war is over." And the doctor said, "Bravo," like that. And I said to him, "What are you saying?" And he said, "He has said, the war is over." And I said, "But certainly it's more than bravo." And he said, "It's a bit late."
Note: it is an undisputed fact that there were no gas chambers at Dachau. Despite this, a brief visual review of Dachau in the US Department of Defense archive reel, discussed in the next section, makes it seem, through poor video editing, that gas chambers were present there. Contemporaneous records. A 1945 film archive shows compilation footage of Nazi concentration camps in the immediate aftermath of World War II. The footage is described as having been gathered by the US Department of Defense as part of the effort to conduct war crimes trials. The link is in the text, but it is not for the faint-hearted. It consists of 6 reels and covers footage from concentration camps in Germany. In Roll 1, from Leipzig, Russian, Czechoslovakian, Polish and French prisoners. From Pienig, Hungarian women and others. In Roll 2, from Ohrdruf, a sub-camp of Buchenwald, they find Polish, Czechoslovakian, Russian, Belgian, German Jews and German political prisoners. From Hadamar, where Polish, Russian and German political and religious dissidents were murdered. This camp was originally a psychiatric clinic, where almost 15,000 people were killed. Quote: resident physicians and staff directly killed the majority of these victims, among whom were German patients with disabilities, mentally disoriented elderly persons from bombed-out areas, half-Jewish children from welfare institutions, psychologically and physically disabled forced laborers, and their children, German soldiers, and foreign Waffen-SS soldiers deemed psychologically incurable. The medical personnel and staff at Hadamar killed almost all of these people by lethal drug overdoses and deliberate neglect. Unquote. In Roll 3, from Haarlem, near Hanover. And from Arnstadt, where, quote, German villagers are forced to exhume Polish and Russian bodies from mass graves. In Roll 4, from Nordhausen. This was a camp for building an underground missile development facility. Quote, prisoners consisted of political German prisoners and other Europeans, including those from France, Belgium, Russia, and Poland. In Roll 5, from Buchenwald. This camp was used for labor for the German arms industry. Quote, the purpose of the camp is to combat political opponents, persecute Jews, Sinti and Roma, and permanently ostracize strangers to the community, among them homosexuals, homeless persons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and ex-convicts, from the body of the German people." Unquote. In Roll 6, from Bergen-Belsen. Until 1943, Bergen-Belsen was exclusively a prisoner of war, POW, camp. As well as the German camps, film reel 3 also shows the Belgian camp at Breendonk, where, quote, "most of the non-Jewish prisoners were leftist members of the Belgian resistance." Unquote. And reel 4 shows the Austrian camp at Mauthausen. This was originally a work camp, to work the granite quarry, and was said to contain, quote, "all Germans and Austrians, and all men." Unquote. These camps were everywhere, and contained a wide range of human beings. These clips were also shown, without a trigger warning, in cinemas in many Allied countries, before the main film of the day. I don't imagine a lot of popcorn was consumed during the screenings. At many locations, as depicted in the reels we've just discussed, the Allied occupation forces insisted on the local population touring the concentration camp nearest them, where they had to view evidence of what had been perpetrated in their midst, and, in their name. This was a part of a process the Allies called Denazification, a term that has recently been used again, by Russia, in relation to their strategic aims in Ukraine. Ian Davis looks at the case for this, in his May 2022 article, "Does Ukraine Need to be Denazified?" From a description of the Allied initiative, post-World War II.
Denazification was an Allied initiative to rid German and Austrian society, culture, press, economy, judiciary, and politics of any remnants of the National Socialist ideology. It was carried out specifically by removing those involved from positions of influence and by disbanding or rendering impotent the organizations associated with it. The program of denazification was launched after the end of the Second World War and was solidified by the Potsdam Agreement.
It is interesting that this U.S. Department of Defense selection of clips, used at the Nuremberg war crimes trials, does not include any from occupied Poland, where it is said that a large percentage of the Jewish dead were murdered. And, apart from a 51-second clip in Reel 5, wrongly placed there as if it were at Dachau, it does not focus on gas chambers either. And yet, gas chambers have become synonymous with the Holocaust, in the modern mind. Further, at Buchenwald, as shown in Reel 5, perhaps in case the locals, or viewers of the film, were not sufficiently shocked by the sight of starved and ill prisoners, and the stench of piles of dead bodies, the Americans supervising the visit also saw fit to display what they said were souvenirs, made for the warped, and perhaps psychotic, controllers of Buchenwald. These items included a lampshade, said to be made from the skin of Jewish prisoners, and 2 shrunken heads. In other post-war Allied denazification propaganda, there was also talk of soap made from the fat from cremated human bodies. Many people, even today, talk of these things as real Nazi depravities, when their actual existence is, at best, suspect. You will not find such things showcased in the official commentaries on the Holocaust today. Also absent from the film is any commentary on the thousands of starving survivors who died on the day their camps were liberated. They died from inappropriate food given them by the liberating troops. From the testimony of Shlomo Cohen on the liberation of Bergen-Belsen.
They gave us what they had with them, a few biscuits, chocolate, and there was a real battle over who could grab first. We thought we were already rescued, but it was not so. There was still no bread a few days later. They started to give out sweetened milk in the camp, they brought parcels and all kinds of cans of preserves. They started distributing lard freely, as much as you wanted, and that was the great tragedy of this camp. People came down with diarrhea, and they started to fill all the toilets, the road, all the paths, and a lot of people died.
The reviled historians. It is this possibility, that somehow, perhaps for good purposes, such as emphasizing the evils of fascism, exaggerations, shall we say, have been added to the historic record, and or other facts omitted, that a number of previously respected historians have spent time looking into the actual contemporaneous records of the Nazi era and reporting their findings. Most of such reports are quite clear that the Holocaust did occur, and that millions of Jews did die during it, of starvation, overwork, typhus, evil medical experiments, torture, and outright mass murder, such as the Barbie Yar massacre of nearly 34,000 Jewish men, women, and children on the outskirts of Kiev in Nazi-occupied Ukraine. However, these historians have not been thanked for their efforts. To the contrary, in recent decades such historical commentary, if it differs at all from the current received narrative, has been reviled, and often censored, with the writers, if in Europe, accused of revisionism and frequently jailed. In the UK, even singing about a different point of view has been cause for jailing one citizen. Consequences. These days most people know of the Holocaust solely in the context of antisemitism, which of course is a very important way to understand this part of our shared history. But by ensconcing the Holocaust in a world apart, one that can no longer be examined or discussed in detail, attention is deflected from alternate understandings, such as the consistent treatment of the other, the Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, the intellectually and physically disabled and the psychiatrically impaired, as well as Jews. It also deflects from the known role of these concentration camps as sources of disposable slave labor for industry, and the large part US and other multinational corporations from Allied countries played in the whole disgusting and deadly debacle. For example, IBM and the Holocaust, the strategic alliance between Nazi Germany and America's most powerful corporation, is a book by investigative journalist and historian Edwin Black. It documents the strategic technology services rendered by American-based multinational corporation International Business Machines, or IBM, and its German and other European subsidiaries, to the Nazi government of Adolf Hitler, from the beginning of the Third Reich in January 1933, through to the last day of the regime in May 1945, at the end of World War II. Some of the matters covered in Edwin Black's book are also covered in the 2016 article, "This is the Hidden Nazi History of IBM and the Man Who Tried to Expose It." Other corporations which collaborated with the Nazis include IG Farben, now Bayer Pharmaceuticals. Not only did IG Farben produce the Zyklon B, which is said to have been used in gas chambers in the concentration camps, it also, quote, relied on concentration camp slave labor throughout World War II and the Holocaust. They built a factory next door to the infamous Auschwitz concentration camp and would use the prisoners at the camp for slave work. Unquote. According to Morning Star, in fact IG Farben had actually built the concentration camp at Auschwitz, and was its legal owner. Bayer, the source of Bayer aspirin, consumed by millions for decades, has become the modern company sprung from the corporate roots of IG Farben. Although 13 of the 24 company directors arraigned were convicted of war crimes, all of these Nazi collaborators received early release, and most of them were reinstated as directors of the new corporations, created out of the dissolution of IG Farben. Fritz Termier, who directed operations at the IG Farben plant at Auschwitz, became the president of Bayer after the war. Bayer did eventually apologize for their role in the Holocaust in 1995. Volkswagen. Throughout the Nazi expansion and war period, Volkswagen used more than 15,000 slaves from concentration camps to build their cars. Volkswagen even built the Arbeitsdorf concentration camp near one of their factories, where they kept a skilled workforce of slaves. In 1998, Volkswagen agreed to set up a voluntary fund that would benefit the victims of the slave labor they used. The Coca-Cola Company. The president of the Coca-Cola Company communicated through a third party to convince Hermann Göring, Hitler's second-in-command, to allow the importation of the Coca-Cola syrup, despite import restrictions. To safeguard the company against future restrictions, they also created Fanta, especially for Nazi Germany. When war was declared, the German branch of the company was officially severed from the Allied branch, but once the war was over, it was back to normal business again. Hugo Boss. Boss was an early member of the Nazi Party. In 1933, Hugo Boss was producing the uniforms for the SS and Hitler Youth, as well as the standard Nazi brown shirts. When Germany began to more intensely remilitarize in 1938, Hugo Boss began to produce uniforms for the Nazi armed forces. From 1940, the company began to use the slave labor of concentration camp victims in order to produce the large orders that they were receiving at that time. The company used around 140 people from concentration camps to work in their factories, along with another 40 French prisoners of war. After the war, the firm went on through leadership of his son. In 1999, the company finally agreed to contribute to a fund that compensated former forced laborers. The Associated Press, often shortened to the AP. The extent and length of AP collaboration is just shocking. Read about it from the link in the text. In 2017, the AP released a statement where they claim that their cooperation was justified, as it allowed them to provide reporting from within Nazi Germany to the outside world. They have not apologized for their actions. There are those who perceive the ideological roots of the Associated Press as again showing, via their reporting of the current conflict in Ukraine. And their blancmange reporting of the Assange extradition hearing was spread all over the world by the legacy media, smothering the detailed reports of the alternative press. Kodak. Kodak European subsidiaries made substantial purchases of photographic equipment from Nazi Germany, providing funds to a foreign enemy of the United States. They also sold large amounts of photographic and electronic devices to the Nazis, much of which was used towards their war effort. In addition to all of that, their German branch used more than 250 slave laborers from Nazi concentration camps. And after the war, Kodak reabsorbed their German subsidiary and profited off of what they had created. Kodak paid $500,000 into a fund providing for families of those used as slave labor for Nazi corporations, but never apologized for their continued business dealings with Nazi Germany. Many thanks to Gabe Paoletti for their very informative 2017 article, from which I have quoted extensively above. Nazi technocracy. Another link between the Third Reich and the corporate West was the impact that the Nazi chief architect, Albert Speer, had on post-war management techniques. Western university schools of management teach of the development of scientific management techniques as emanating from the work of Frederick Winslow Taylor, and later from Henry Ford, but the example of Albert Speer, and his emphasis on efficiency above all, strongly impressed itself on the Western curriculum. Although beginning his career as a Nazi architect of buildings, he later graduated to a position as the very successful architect of the Third Reich's war machine. In the summer of 1941, Speer turned to war work, and erected factories all over Europe for war production and air raid shelters. He also directed the repair of bomb-damaged transport facilities in the conquered East. Then in February 1942, Speer was named Hitler's Minister of Armaments and Munitions Production. Speer's efficiency in planning and organizing production, which had been demonstrated in his construction projects, made him invaluable to the war effort. He became number 2 in Germany, in terms of power and authority. Thus Speer, one of the best and brightest, joined the worst, at the top of the Nazi hierarchy. As Minister of Armaments he had to use great ingenuity to acquire workers, and to keep armament production going during the war. Millions of forced laborers were brought from the East, from concentration camps, and from German-occupied territories, to work long hours, often under dreadful conditions, in the plants he willingly controlled. When I first read Gitta Serena's 1996 book, Albert Speer, His Battle with Truth, I was shocked to discover the extensive parallels between the Speer era of Nazi management and modern, especially US-based, management theory. Had I known at that time about Operation Paperclip, and the extensive influx of Nazi scientists and technocrats to the post-war United States, and their eventual creation and control of NASA, I might have been less shocked. When a 1999 play about Albert Speer was being mounted, the playwright Esther Vila was interviewed by The Guardian. she was quoted as saying, "Efficiency was so important to Speer that nothing else counted. He didn't care what should be done. He cared for only what could be done." I think modern management needs to look at that and beware. Perhaps in an age when no one is guilty, and yesterday's villains are rehabilitated as today's heroes, we should not be surprised that many feel equivocal about Albert Speer. Certainly, in an age when efficiency and cost-effectiveness are prized above the happiness of human beings, this story is one that we should heed. Found guilty on the 30th of September 1946 for his use of slave labor in the armaments factories, Albert Speer avoided the hangman, and was sentenced to 20 years in Berlin's Spandau prison. Nazi impact on the science. Nazi influence and impact on science, and what we now think of as the science, has also been a problem, one which I don't want to go into in detail here. But I do recommend that you watch Robert Proctor, Nazi Science and Ideology, the Lex Friedman podcast number 268, on this topic. Robert Proctor starts with,
We tend to think of science as always on the side of liberty, as always on the side of enlightenment, as always on the side of enlarging human possibility. And here we have this phenomenon, in the 1930s, of the world's leading scientific power, the Third Reich, which collectively had won a big chunk of all the Nobel Prizes. Suddenly they go fascist. They go Nazi. With Hitler, instead of being primarily a source of resistance, science in many respects is actually a full collaborator in the most horrific forms of Nazi genocide, Nazi exclusion. And that's a relatively untold story in the sense that, when we think of science in the Third Reich, we think of Joseph Mengele injecting dye into the eyes of twins, or we think of horrific human experiments. And those are real, but it's also the story of a huge scientific apparatus, a bureaucracy you could almost say, participating in every phase of the campaigns of Nazi destruction. And what I looked at in particular in my first book was how physicians in particular, but also biomedical science, was collaborating with the regime. And it's wrong to think of the Nazi regime as anti-science. It is anti a particular type of science. In particular, it was radically against what they called Jewish science, communist science. They were against certain types of science that they did not like.
Here are some more snippets from this very long session.
We tend to think of science and ideology as completely separate, when I think the reality is they are not. I guess the saddening thing I learned from looking at the Nazi science era is how easily people can become part of a machine. If there's power, people can be found to follow it. Many scientists and physicians were willing to work for the Nazi regime, for multiple reasons, partly because a lot of them really thought they were doing the Lord's work. They thought they were cleaning the world of filth. I mean, if you really thought Jews are a parasitic race, why wouldn't you get rid of them? So there's an ontology there. There's a theory of the world that they're building on.
Robert Proctor also notes that, quote, "If we imagine that nothing like the Nazi experiments went on here in the United States, that would be a big mistake." Unquote. He cites many examples of shocking practices at the hands of US scientists. Near the end, he goes on to add that he is interested in the things science doesn't study, due to its ontological bias, saying, "We have all kinds of blinders. One of the things I'm interested in is finding some of the gaping holes, the ideological gaps, that have been ignored because of ideology, left or right, that would prevent us from seeing some deep, objective scientific truth." Unquote. Remembering and rethinking, rather than deplatforming, censoring, and forgetting, is a big theme in this discussion. Early in the interview, Lex Friedman asks, "So is this a process of ideology polluting science, or is it science empowering ideology?" We all need to think about that, in relation to what is said to be the science, in our own time. Relevance in the current age. Commenting on the work of US state employees during his 2013 Oxford Union address, Julian Assange referred, as is a theme here, to the Nuremberg trials, when discussing the leak of the US rules of engagement. This was one of the documents Assange is now facing a life in jail for publishing.
As opposed to what is sometimes put about, WikiLeaks is not an organization that hates intelligence agencies. Far from it. its very base, the idea of intelligence is an optimistic one. It's that one can understand the world, one can apply intelligence to understand. The problem is the corruption of those agencies, and that corruption comes about because of secrecy. So when Tom spoke about, in somewhat glowing terms, the improved process that he put down, and I believe him that that is a significant improvement from what was there before, it all rests upon one thing. It rests upon the abilities of people in those agencies to get out information to the public when those processes are not followed. It's only through this pressure of producing analytical product to the public that these sorts of agencies are kept honest and don't become simply robots that are in effect, perhaps it's drawing the bow too far, but some kind of Hitler's willing executioners, mere people who act as robots who are told to carry out a task and do it. That is not enough. It is not enough to agree to carry out a task for superiors. That is the Nuremberg defense. We must all look to ourselves and understand whether what we are doing is right and just, not just according to the views of our superiors, but according to the long view of history, according to human rights and to our feelings of compassion, if we have any.